Hello. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're staying home, staying safe during these extraordinary times. I'm back to read another chapter of my books. Before I begin tonight, I promised I would wish happy birthday to someone who's been watching. So a belated happy. This is to Breeze Buckner, Nee Higgins from New York, and that's from Bobby McGee, who's from Arglass, and his mother-in-law is from Belfast. Grew up in Belfast and later emigrated, and she relates so much to my book. So that's especially for you, Breeze. I hope you really enjoy this tonight. And yes, we're on to Breadboy now, and I'm moving on to chapter 2 of Breadboy, and this chapter is called "The King is Dead." The life of Elvis the King ended on Tuesday, and the career of Tony the Bread Boy began on Saturday. I awoke with the start to the 6 o'clock news. In my dreams, I had slept in at least a dozen times. I had spent the night intermittently waking up in a panic before realizing it was just another dream. In one of these nightmares, Leslie had sacked me before I had even had the chance to deliver a single pap. He had kicked me down the steps of the Ormo mini shop in front of the whole street. Angry neighbours threw potato fires at me as I stood in the middle of the road in my pyjamas. In another dream, my punishment for being late was to be beamed up, to be exterminated by 1,000 Daleks, and the doctor didn't arrive at the last minute to save me with his sonic screwdriver. As I surfaced enthusiastically from beneath the sheets, I briefly recalled another dream involving Olivia Newton-John, but this had had a much more pleasant outcome. I always had a feeling of dread when the news came on because I was afraid someone I knew had been shot or blown up. But this morning the main news was that Elvis was still dead. A medley of the Elvis rock and roll years ensued, and this ensured I got up immediately. This was not the best time to admit it publicly, but I never liked Elvis. At my guitar lessons on Friday nights with Mr. Rowing, I had been forced to play Love Me Tender and Cheating Heart. All I wanted to learn was the latest #1 hit, like Knowing Me, Knowing You by ABBA, or Don't Give Up on Us, Baby by Hutch without Starsky, which was written by a man with exactly the same name as me. All that blue suede shoes lip curling from the young thin Elvis seemed so old-fashioned to me, especially compared to the very latest progressive rock of Smokey. I was bored by the incessant repeats on television of all those old films of Elvis with a flowery garland round his neck on a beach in Hawaii, singing songs to nice ladies in coconut bras and grass skirts. And the more up-to-date, fat Elvis was even worse, crooning ballads in Las Vegas in a white sequined catsuit, which showed considerable strain in the belly region. Of course, my mother and my granny loved Elvis. Granny loved him more than Valium. She cried during Are You Lonesome Tonight and said, "He's still a lovely wee fella, so he is," when it was obvious that he was far from wee, so he was. Meanwhile, my mother's adoration of the king was not without a certain dietary critique. Mommy regularly referred to the expanding Presley waistline as a cautionary lesson when she caught me eating peanut butter on a spoon straight from the jar. "You don't want to end up looking like Elvis, love, now, do you?" she said. For some unknown reason, all the Protestant paramilitaries adored Elvis, even though he sang a song about crying in the chapel, which sounded very Catholic to me. I doubted if Elvis had ever held a string on the banner in the parade on the 12th when he was a wee boy. In fact, I was pretty sure there was no 12th of July in America because they had the 4th of July instead. I had never seen an orange parade on the Waltons. But having said that, I was convinced that John Boy and his family were Protestants because they looked very like people from Ballymena. And Grandma Walton looked like the sort of woman who would make a delicious apple tart for the field. Anyway, in spite of any clear evidence of loyalist leanings, Elvis was still the mascot of the UDA, and he was always pick of the pops at the UVF drinking club down the road. Every paramilitary had Elvis sideburns, which must have itched something desperate underneath their balaclavas. On this monumental morning of my bread delivery debut, I knew everyone in the whole world, apart from me, was grieving for the king. But I soon realised that this would provide me with an unexpected opportunity to shine on the first day of my new job. Unlike everyone else, I was not distracted by grief, and so I could focus entirely on my induction. I knew I could dazzle Leslie with excellent customer delivery skills I had acquired during my former career as a paperboy. Furthermore, I knew from experience that the people of the Upper Shankill still wanted fed, no matter how bad things were on the streets or in the wider world. People still needed bread to live with or without Elvis. Onward with my new career. I tiptoed down the thinning shag pile on the stairs and gently opened the front door, trying hard not to wake anyone in the family. As I stepped out into the bright August morning, I could smell Dad's best red rose bush beside the front door, and I could hear wee birds chirping in the hawthorn bushes up the fields at the end of our street. Our houses were the last ones before the fields began a steep climb up the Black Mountain. It was all grass and nettles and cow's clap at the end of our street. A few doors away, Mr. Oliver had clipped his hedge into the shape of a big rooster, and a little robin redbreast was sitting on top of it. I almost expected the hedge to do a cock-a-doodle-doo. I gently closed the front door and strode purposefully down our thoroughly bleached front step towards the rest of my career. Leslie was waiting for me at the top of the steep steps into the mini shop, smiling with every tooth he could muster. "Well, young fella, are you all set?" he asked encouragingly. "Aye," I replied monosyllabically. Before we drove off, Leslie sat me down in the driver's cab and acquainted me with the ropes. He started off with the basics. The most fundamental information was the difference between a plain loaf and a pan loaf. Until this day, I had been unaware of the distinction between the two types of loaf. A pan loaf was longer and smoother and whiter, and a plain loaf was shorter and fatter and rougher. It was a little confusing for me to begin with because, in some ways, a pan loaf was plainer and certainly blander than a plain loaf. A pan loaf had a soft crust and was good for making sandwiches for the Sunday school excursion, while a plain loaf had a dark, crispy crust that was great for dunking in a can of tomato soup. It occurred to me that pan loaves and plain loaves were a bit like Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, basically the same, but with a slightly different consistency underneath their crusts. So, let's say hello to who's joined me this evening. Hello, Nigel. Great to have you again. And Alan, the regular. Hello, Ali Bennett. Lovely to have you. Listening to you armed with treats from the Guide Dog virtual tea party today. Well, that sounds like fun. Robbie Lee. Hi, Robbie from Carrickfergus. And hello, Michael McKinley Sr. Hello, Jim Poole. I'm glad you're enjoying listening to the new book. Hello, Ronnie Black from Belfast. And hi, Evelyn Brown, the lovely Leslie from up the country, who is also my production manager, who sets this all up and makes sure there's enough light for me to be able to read and also for you to be able to see me. Hi, Sadie Hannah. Glad you're listening again and enjoying it. Good evening, Norma Sloan and John McLaughlin and Joan Towell. I'm glad you're enjoying it, Evelyn. Hi, Claire Wilson and David Blevins and Colin McShane. Hi, Ian Parsley, Linda Gillespie and Patrick Kelly and Andy McCauley. It's good to have you all along. I hope you enjoy the rest of the story about my very first day as a bread boy. To my great disappointment, Leslie advised me that the two responsibilities I longed for the most would initially be denied me. The first task from which I was forbidden was putting money in the till. I wasn't sure whether this restriction meant that Leslie thought I couldn't count or that I might thieve, but either way, I was slightly affronted. Did he think I was a wee hoot who would steal the money? Did he not know I was a wee good-living fella that had never shoplifted a single sweetie mouse in Old Mac's newsagents? Or did he think I couldn't do the sums, even though I had come top of the class in maths exams at BRA and only smart people went there? I had collected paper money for years. I had never thieved and always counted correctly, even when under attack from wee hoods and robbers. I had been top of the class in maths for years, until Timothy Longsley started revising and beat me in every exam. The second forbidden task was even a bigger disappointment. I was not allowed to push the big red diddly ding button. I could understand not being allowed to handle the money because most wee lads thieved, but there was no good reason why I should not be allowed to press the button. This was outrageous. Did he think I was going to break it? I knew how to press a button. I did it every day on my cassette recorder. I was 14 years old now. After all, I was not a kid like my wee brother who broke a Star Wars R2-D2 robot by pressing the speak button too hard. That Leslie was just keeping all the best jobs for himself. I knew he would regret all the lead vocals. Patrick Walsh, who played violin better than me at the School of Music, said Protestants kept all the best jobs for themselves. I thought this couldn't be true because my father got sent a bullet to his locker at the foundry for giving a Catholic a job. But here was evidence that Patrick might have a point after all. As we proceeded on my virgin bread run, Leslie continued with the induction process. He advised me of a whole range of policies and procedures. I could barely take it all in. Leslie explained in very serious tones that Procea loaves were medicine bread for people who were allergic or something. This made him look and sound like a bread doctor in his white coat, apart from the big Ormo butterfly on the pocket. As we crisscrossed the estates of the Upper Shankill on that first Saturday morning, the master bread man explained a whole set of do's and don'ts. I was to keep an eye on wee hoods who came into the shop. Leslie explained that these characters did not normally get up early on a Saturday morning, a relief after my experiences as a paper boy, so if they ever did come into the van, I was to consider them shoplifters. I also gleaned that I should never permit customers to open a fizzy drinks can within the confines of the mini shop. Them wee minerals explode because of us going over all them old security ramps, he said. To my delight, I was then informed that damaged goods should never be sold, but always kept aside for our mid-morning break to wash down with a can of lilt. Even on that very first morning, I was tempted to deliberately drop and damage a delicious-looking Victoria sponge. Once Leslie had exhausted all of the official requirements of the job, he suggested that a good bread boy would also make a good junior orange man and a member of the boys' brigade. I declined invitations to join both institutions by explaining that I was already a scout and that my atheist dad did not allow me to join the orange. That father of yours has some queer funny ideas, commented Leslie. This was not the first time I had heard such a remark. Daddy preferred to disagree than to agree with everybody else. I soon discovered that only listening to Leslie would never fully equip me for my newfound profession. I had to learn from experience, and the only way to develop skills in customer relations was to deal with an assortment of customers. I knew I was going to have to be sensitive to the grief attending almost every customer because of the recent demise of the king. It was a particularly dark morning in the Upper Shankill. It was like Ian Paisley himself had died. We started the bread round in my own street. Mrs. Piper was the first to enter the mini shop that morning, clutching her large black leather handbag and repeatedly pulling her unbuttoned cardigan across her expansive bosom. Mrs. Piper's breasts always confused me. The older I got, the more difficult I was finding it not to look at breasts. It was strange, as if breasts had special magnets inside them, drawing my eyes in their direction. If a woman had big breasts like Raquel Welch, then she was usually dead sexy, and you kept your eyes looking at her even when you tried to stop. But when it came to Mrs. Piper's ample bosom, I had to try not to look in the first place. There was nothing sexy about Mrs. Piper, and yet the magnets in her breasts seemed to work just like Raquel Welch's. It was difficult because her bosom was very large by any standard, and also because she never smiled and always stared at you like you had been up to something sinful. As a result of this stern countenance, I tried not to look at her in the face either. This left very few remaining parts of Mrs. Piper that I could comfortably look at. However, today I did look at her face because she entered the van crying. Mrs. Piper was in mourning over the death of the king. "Oh, God love him. He's in a better place now," she wept. "He was a lovely wee good living fella and sang all them lovely gospel songs, so he did." I was surprised at Mrs. Piper's distress over the dead Elvis because I knew for a fact that she strongly disapproved of sinful rock music. Mrs. Piper was very saved indeed. She had once complained to the Reverend Lowe that my da was a devil in sheep's clothing because he was the DJ playing Shawaddy Waddy to them poor innocent wee children at the Westie Disco. She had clearly never been inside the Westie Disco to meet the innocents. Mrs. Piper was convinced that Elvis was saved because he sang "How Great Thou Art" with such feeling. She seemed more forgiving of Elvis's sins than anybody else's. She bought a small white plane and a packet of German biscuits. I couldn't understand why these biscuits were called German because I never saw any German soldiers eating them in all those black and white war movies. As Leslie revved the engine and pressed the diddly-ding button to head towards the next stop, I also wondered if Kimberley Mikados and coconut creams were called Irish biscuits in Germany. After several more grief-stricken Elvis fans arrived seeking bread and crumbs of comfort, we crawled up the street to Mrs. Grant's house. Leslie explained that she rarely entered the van itself, God love her, because her Richard was always bad with his pains, so I had to bring her bread order to the front door. "Och, look at you, you wee crater," she exclaimed as she answered the doorbell. "You're all grown up now and doing the bread for Leslie McGregor." Mrs. Grant had a way of stating the obvious, but I liked her because she had always tipped me well as a paper boy. The poor woman had an awful lot to contend with because of her Richard and her only son, who was a genius at university in England and never came home to see her. "Thanks, love," she said, as I conscientiously closed her front gate behind me. Up until this point, it had been the first Elvis-free conversation of the morning. Everyone was saying how terrible it all was, and it reminded them of when some brilliant president in America was shot dead, and they all remembered what they were doing that day too. But Mrs. Grant belatedly joined in the wake with the comment, "There will only ever be one Elvis Presley." I nodded sensitively, like one of the undertakers from Wilton's on the Crumlin Road. I hoped that Mrs. Grant was right, but within a year, there were at least a dozen Elvises in Belfast alone. As we turned the corner into the next street, on our way towards the main Ballygamartin Road, Leslie gave me the bad news that I had to deliver 2 plain and a wheaten bannock to Mr. Black in number 13. Mr. Black had a grumpy old bake and 2 greyhounds that barked and snapped at your ankles. With his limited social skills, it was unsurprising that he never joined us inside the mini shop. Instead, I had to leave his bread beside his back door on the kitchen windowsill, which was always sticky with white gloss paint. I was hoping that this would require no interpersonal interaction with Mr. Black. But on that very first morning, his barking greyhounds attempted to chew on my Dr. Martens and must have wakened him. Just as I was escaping, he opened the back door in his dressing gown, which made him look like George out of George and Mildred on UTV. "You're late," he accused. "Sorry, Mr. Black, it's my first week and Elvis is dead." "And leave them dogs alone, you wee hallion," he added, ignoring my explanation. Mr. Black retrieved his bread from the windowsill and slammed the door without so much as a thank you for my services or a word of commiseration on the passing of the king. Face. Leslie said, "Come here till I tell you, fella. See him? He's hateful to everyone, except them there dogs of his. I appreciated this support from my line manager. Leslie was being protective. He'd clearly realised already that I was going to be good. And in return, I understood that employee satisfaction was high on his agenda. The Saturday morning bread round involved circling the whole of the Upper Shankill. We started out in my street of neat semis and then went down the road to all the old red brick terraced houses. Next, we skirted the enemy territory of Ardoyne, where the IRA lived, to serve the pensioners who lived in small houses with metal grilles on their windows on the peace line. Then we turned back up the hill to serve the big estate, where they had a green for the 11th Boney and a community centre for paramilitaries. Next, we drove along another high peace wall that protected us from the other side. And finally, tired from all our labours, we crossed the main road, dividing the council estate from our posh 3-bedroom semis, and we slowly retraced our tracks back to my house again. I already knew most of the customers in my street. In fact, I even had a previous customer service relationship with most of them from being a paper boy and doing wee jobs for 10 pence a go as a scout during Bob a Job week. However, once we headed down the road and the big estate, I met all sorts of new customers. So before I tell you about all my new customers, I'll just say hello to a few more people. Hello there, Brian Smith, and signing my copy of Breadboy in the dedication for my late father Warren in 2017 at the Macaulay Gathering. Oh, I remember that, Mark. You're very welcome. Good to have you connecting again. Hello, Francis. Hi, Anne Kirk. You're enjoying reading the book. That's great. Hello, Brendan and Ruth. Hi, Francis and Sadie. They're saying hello to each other. Hello, Neve. I'm glad you're enjoying Breadboy. Good to have you along. And hello, David, as well. So, I'm going to tell you more about my customers. Miss Adams lived in one of the very neat old terraced houses with a tiny front garden on the main road. I was fairly certain Miss Adams wasn't related to Jerry. She was in her 70s and had never married. She was what my mother called a spinster and a real lady. Like my great Aunt Maud, who wore pearls and spoke proper and lived in a nursing home. I sometimes noticed Miss Adams at church in a fur coat on Remembrance Sunday. Her father had been a soldier in the Great War, but he had been dead now much longer than Elvis. Miss Adams was so thin and fragile, I feared she would snap in two if she slipped on the steep steps up into the van. But thankfully, on my first morning on duty, she avoided any such trauma. "Good morning, Miss Adams," said Leslie politely. "Good morning, Mr. McGregor," she replied. "Lovely day," commented Leslie. "Gives rain," replied Miss Adams. "What can I do for you this morning, Miss Adams?" asked Leslie. "Just a small pan and a chocolate Swiss roll, please, if you don't mind, Mr. McGregor," Miss Adams responded pleasantly. It sounded more like "Are You Being Served" on BBC One than the Ormo Mini Shop up the Shankill. "Dreadful business about that young singer," said Miss Adams. "He was such a nice young man." Then she looked at me and added, as if in some way connecting me with the late Elvis Presley, "Only always do your very best, young man, as your very best is only always what you can do." As we departed, this riddle rang in my ears. I couldn't quite work it out, but I assumed Miss Adams meant that I should try to do a good job delivering the bread. I feared that the next section of the bread round would be a more dangerous part of the job, serving pensioners on the peace line beside Ardoyne. However, it turned out to be very peaceful on the peace line so early on a Saturday morning. Petrol bombers mustn't have used amazing white plastic digital alarm clocks at the weekend. The only hazards were the remains of riots from the night before. Leslie had to swerve around broken bottles and smashed red bricks on scorched tarmac. All the little houses were very similar along this road, and all the old ladies wore the same housecoats and had the same hairstyle of slightly pink hair and curlers. It was like serving bread to a street full of Hilda Ogdens from Coronation Street. Almost everyone got one pan, one plain, 2 soda farls and 2 potato farls. This was their bread for the week. Everyone paid out of the same red leather purse, and they all said Thanks very much, now, love. One of our customers on the peace line was Mrs. McAllister. She lived in a house with metal grids across all the windows to stop stones and petrol bombs getting in, with her only daughter who was in a wheelchair. Their house looked like a big hamster cage, but if you looked through the metal grids, you could see beautiful Delft horses on the inside windowsills looking out at you. Here, take in a coke for the wee girl in the wheelchair, son, said Leslie. She's not right, but she loves a wee mineral. I did as I was bid, and Mrs. McAllister's daughter shrieked with delight at the sight of the can of cola. She had one of the happiest faces I had ever seen, even though she lived in a wheelchair in a house with caged windows on the peace line. Maybe there were advantages to being not right. I was very pleased to meet her. She pointed to a picture of Elvis on the wall and chuckled. Mrs. McAllister had torn the king out of the sun and stuck him up on the wall of her working kitchen beside the Queen. I pointed and chuckled too, and felt quite evil for doing so. Once we left the peace line behind, we relaxed on our way back up the main road, past Mac's newsagent shop and towards the big estate. This was the longest uninterrupted drive of the day, and it provided a brief repose from bread before the busiest part of the morning in the council estate, where people queued up to get into the Ormo mini shop. Leslie whistled a hymn as we travelled onward. I think it was Bread of Heaven. The first customers to arrive in the van when we stopped in the estate were Mr. and Mrs. Rossbottom. The Rossbottoms weren't just fat. They were what my biology teacher called obese, and I was soon to learn why. 6 pan, 4 plain, 4 boxes of gravy rings, 8 soda, 8 teddy fars, 2 boxes of tonics tea cakes, 4 cokes, a packet of coconut slices, and 3 of them there wee packets of chocolate digestive biscuits, love, said Mrs. Rossbottom. This was too much bread and confectionery for a new bread boy to remember in one go, so I had to ask her to repeat the order several times. Mrs. Rossbottom was smaller than her husband, and this made her exceptionally round. She reminded me of one of my wee brother's favourite toys, a Weeble, which wobbled but never fell down, no matter how many times you pushed it over. I had an urge to knock Mrs. Rossbottom over just to see if she would bounce up again. Mr. Rossbottom was bigger than his wife, both vertically and horizontally, and he was a man of very few words. I gradually learned that his main function on a Saturday morning was to transport most of their huge stock of goods into the house. However, he did make one remark that first morning, given the exceptional circumstances. "He's not dead, He's still alive," he whispered in Leslie's ear as he burdened the steps beneath him. "That's it, brother. Praise the Lord," agreed Leslie, clearly mistaking the remark as devotion to Jesus rather than Elvis. "That'll keep yous going over the weekend," said Leslie, as the couple headed towards the steps with several kilograms of bread loaded in their chubby arms. "Demons must have a powerful lot of children to feed," I said to Leslie as we drove off in the considerably lightened van. "No, son, them two live on their own." For some strange reason, my first encounter with the Rossbottoms made me feel hungry. Billy Cooper's wee granny with the curlers was next to enter the van. She was not a woman for small talk, and simply presented her weekly request. "A pan, a plain, 2 soda and 2 potato," she said. The next customer on the estate was a very important man. In fact, he was the most important man in the whole neighbourhood. Big Duff was a paramilitary with tattoos and big gold rings and an Ulster flag hanging from his bedroom window all year round. Everyone in the estate was dead scared of him, because if you didn't give him money for the loyalist prisoners, or if you mixed with Catholics apart from to hurt them, then he could get you put out of the estate. He never carried out the intimidation personally because he was too busy running the bar in the community centre. Instead, he got wee hard lads, the ones at my primary school who couldn't read, to put on balaclavas to do his. Leslie tiptoed around Big Duff and was very careful about what he said to him, as if he was someone really important, like the Prime Minister or Gloria Honeyford. Elvis. The king was hard to listen to, but at least he never got anyone kneecapped for robbing the post office. I was afraid that if Big Duff found out that I was a teenage pacifist who tried not to hate Catholics too much, I would be banished from ever delivering another soda farl on his estate. But in spite of my fear and resentment of Big Duff, I understood that this week must have been a difficult time for him because of Elvis and all. So I attempted to make a customer-provider connection. I'm sure you're raging about Elvis, Big Duff, I faltered as I handed a paramilitary a pan loaf. I was making small talk with a real live paramilitary. I hoped Jesus wouldn't mind. I genuinely couldn't think of any "thou shalt not talk to paramilitaries" in the Bible, not even in the King James Version. I had never encountered such a reputedly dangerous man before, although it was rumoured one year when I was a wee boy that Santa, whose knee I sat on in the grotto in town, was actually a brigadier in the UDA. "Listen to me, son," he replied with a definite air of power. I obeyed, and as my nervous fingers dug into his pan loaf, he continued, "You see, there's them uns that's born for greatness, and there's them uns that's not. And Elvis Presley was," his voice cracked with emotion, "the king." I was shocked. Big Duff was filling up. This did not correspond with his reputation. He wiped a tear from his eye and rubbed his nose on the Ulster tattoo on the back of his hand. I had not expected these emotions from a loyalist leader. It had never occurred to me that paramilitaries cried, especially not over American rock and roll singers. Then Big Duff composed himself and announced, "My community regrets the passing of a great man." Although I disagreed with the pronouncement, I realised that when Big Duff said "my community," you weren't allowed to contradict him, or you wouldn't be allowed in his community anymore. I dutifully handed him over his pan loaf, and he departed the van with a walk of great authority. Leslie sighed and quickly pressed the diddly-ding button, and this satisfactorily changed the atmosphere. As we drove off, I looked back at Big Duff through the rear window. I could just make out a hole in the side of his pan loaf, where my fingers had pierced the packaging during the tense encounter. I prayed that he wouldn't notice, or I would be in big trouble. I imagined Big Duff chasing me in his Ford Cortina, like in the Sweeney, and catching up with me in a dead-end entry and forcing me to replace the loaf, or else. Halfway through the estate, we parked beside the bins at the back of the chippy, where no customers would disturb us. It was 10 a.m. and time for my first mid-morning break, and we tucked into a mortally damaged box of apple turnovers. Just as we were finishing our cans of lilt, my old mate, Philip Ferris, arrived at the van to ask for change of a £10 note for his mummy's coal man. This was typical of Philip Ferris. Not only did he enter the van while the workers were officially off duty, but he also had the cheek to ask for a currency exchange service without so much as an apology for failing even to buy a crumb of bread. But at least Philip provided some relief from the incessant adoration of Elvis, which had dominated my first day as a paper boy, as a bread boy. Get mixed up. As he climbed down the steps of the van, with 10 £1 notes stuffed in the breast pocket of his Wrangler jacket, I realised we had not yet commiserated. "Did you hear about Elvis?" I inquired. "Elvis Presley? So what? He was bollocks," replied Philip Ferris. Philip was usually very annoying because he was never impressed by anyone, apart from Geordie Best. But on this one instance, I had to concur with his assessment. However, Philip's use of bad language in Leslie's presence did not go down well at all. "Come here till I tell you, wee lad," interjected Leslie. "Any more of that old cursing of yours, and I'll tell your da, and you'll be off the BB football team next year." I could tell by Philip's face that he took this threat very seriously. However, as he walked off sulkily, I'm sure I heard a further muffled bollocks under his breath. When we finally arrived back in my street that first Saturday morning, Leslie pulled up the handbrake with a sigh of satisfaction at a job well done. Well done, young lad, he said. You'll do all right, so you in the light of this professional praise. Leslie presented me with my £3.50 wages, which I'd already spent in my head on a fish supper and a plastic Millennium Falcon. As a bonus, he presented me with a damaged packet of potato farls and a dented crusty loaf. I thanked my boss politely, jumped down the steps of the van in one leap, and ran into the house proudly. Boils. Dad was in the kitchen, melting lard in the pan to make us a big Ulster fry, and it smelt delicious. Did a farls as a contribution. Caveman coming home from the handle on downtown radio, and I sang along, spat from the cooker across the kitchen. Much did your man McGregor pay you, son? Asked Daddy as he slapped the streaky bacon into the bubbling pan. £3.50, Daddy, I replied. My father rolled his eyes and shook his head. Without so much as a word, I was able to translate these gestures as saying that if your man Leslie was that good living, you would think he would pay a wee lad better than that. Mummy was in the living room, sewing a halter-neck dress for a swanky woman from Glengormley to wear to a dinner dance for guide dogs in the boarded-up Europa Hotel. How'd you get on with your bread, love? She called from the next room. Aye, dead on, I replied, as my mouth began to water from my fried potato farls. Was any of them old dolls bad to you? She inquired. No, Mammy, just Mr. Black, but sure he's an old blurt to everyone, I answered, as the smell of crispy bacon began to permeate the entire house. I pay no attention to that old gat, love. All he cares about is them bloody greyhounds, she added supportively. Is everybody still distracted about Elvis, love? She added. Aye, Mammy, I replied. Fries ready, shouted Daddy. My two brothers appeared from the garden shed where my big brother had just won my wee brother's pocket money in a game of poker. We all sat down together as a family around the Formica picnic table that just about fitted into our living room. Our Ulster fry was served, complete with the potato farls I had contributed to the house. It was a perfect Saturday morning. The king may have been dead, but my new career as a bread boy had just been born, so it had. So there you are, that's chapter 2 of Breadboy. Just say hello to a few more people. Thank you for joining me. Hello, Edwin in Uganda, and hi, Alex, BRAO girl. Good to have you along, Alex. Hi, Patsy McConnell. I looked in late, so we'll watch a little later. Also excited to hear about the new book. Oh yeah, that's brilliant. Patsy, and hello, Amy Nolan in USA, and Pam Gilmore. Hi, Davey Dunwoody. Good to have you along. And my lovely niece, Leanne's here. And hello, Jane Marks, and also Mike Moran. Good to have you. Hope you're all well. Hello, Claire Wilson too. I'm glad you enjoyed it. So thanks very much. I'll be back same time tomorrow night for chapter 3 of Breadboy. Until then, stay safe, stay home, and stay well. And of course, stay positive.